Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the Great Russian War, a conflict that unfolded in the middle years of the 16th century. Between the years 1554 and 1557, this was a war that took place in the cold northern reaches of Europe, where the Kingdom of Sweden and the Tsardom of Russia met along the disputed borderlands of Karelia and Ingria. It was a time when two powerful rulers, each claiming divine right and sovereign authority, found themselves locked in a struggle over territory, pride, and the very nature of royal legitimacy itself. To understand this war, we must first journey back to a time when the map of Northern Europe was still being drawn, when borders were fluid and uncertain, and when the frozen forests and ice-covered lakes of the frontier regions witnessed the passage of armies and the clash of competing ambitions. This is a story of winter campaigns and summer sieges, of diplomatic insults and battlefield courage, of a war that began almost by accident and ended without a clear victor, yet left its mark on the history of two great nations. The stage is set. Northern Europe in the mid-1500s. The world of the 1550s was one of profound transformation. In Western Europe, the Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of Christendom, creating new religious divisions that would shape politics and warfare for generations to come. The Catholic Church, which had once held unchallenged spiritual authority across the continent, now found itself competing with various Protestant movements, each claiming to offer a purer path to salvation. In the far north of Europe, two kingdoms were rising in power and ambition. To the west stood Sweden, a nation that had only recently secured its independence from Danish domination. To the east lay Russia, a vast realm centered on Moscow, growing in strength and territorial extent under its formidable ruler, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Between these two powers stretched a frontier zone of forests, lakes, and marshlands, inhabited by Finnish and Karelian peoples whose loyalties were divided and whose lands had long been contested. This was the region where Swedish and Russian interests would inevitably collide, where the ambitions of kings would be tested in the harsh climate of the northern wilderness. Gustav Vasa, the founder of Swedish independence.
To understand the Swedish side of this conflict, we must first become acquainted with Gustav Vasa, one of the most remarkable monarchs in Swedish history. Born in 1496 to a noble family, Gustav Eriksson Vasa came of age during a time of crisis for his homeland. Sweden was then part of the Kalmar Union, a political arrangement that had joined Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch since 1389. The union was troubled from the start, marked by Swedish resentment of Danish dominance and periodic revolts against royal authority. In 1520, when Gustav Vasa was a young man of 24, events took a dramatic and terrible turn. King Christian II of Denmark, determined to crush Swedish resistance once and for all, invited the Swedish nobility to a reconciliation meeting in Stockholm. It was a trap. On November 8, 1520, in what became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath, Danish soldiers executed nearly 100 prominent Swedes, including Gustav's father. This massacre proved to be Christian's great miscalculation. Rather than breaking Swedish resistance, it inflamed it. Gustav Vasa emerged as the leader of a popular uprising, rallying peasants and nobles alike to the cause of Swedish independence. His journey from fugitive to freedom fighter has become the stuff of Swedish legend. Fleeing through the winter wilderness, he was pursued by Danish loyalists, but the common people of the province of Dalarna rallied to his cause, catching up with him before he reached the Norwegian border and convincing him to return and lead the rebellion. The famous cross-country ski race known as the Vasaloppet commemorates Gustav's flight and return, a testament to how deeply his story has become woven into Swedish national identity. What began with just 400 men in early 1521 grew into a national movement. By June 6, 1523, Gustav Vasa was elected King of Sweden, and 11 days later, he made his triumphant entry into Stockholm. Sweden's independence was secure, and June 6th remains Sweden's national day to this day. Gustav proved to be not just a military leader, but a shrewd and calculating monarch. He understood that true independence required more than military victory. It required the complete transformation of Swedish society and government. With remarkable determination, he set about breaking the power of the Catholic Church in Sweden,
nationalizing its vast landholdings and establishing a Lutheran state church under royal control. This was not merely a religious reformation, it was a political revolution that concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of the king. By the time of the Russian War in the 1550s, Gustav Vasa had been on the throne for more than 3 decades. He had transformed Sweden from a rebellious province into a unified kingdom, abolished the elective monarchy in favor of hereditary succession, created Europe's first standing national army of citizen soldiers, and established the foundations for what would become, in the next century, one of Europe's great powers. Yet for all his achievements, Gustav remained in many ways a rough-hewn figure, a self-made king who had clawed his way to power through rebellion and civil war. This background would prove significant in his dealings with Ivan IV of Russia, for Ivan viewed himself as the heir to the Byzantine emperors, a ruler whose legitimacy derived from ancient imperial bloodlines. The two men could hardly have been more different in their conception of royal authority, and this fundamental disagreement would color all their interactions. Ivan IV, the terrible Tsar. If Gustav Vasa represented the self-made monarch, Ivan IV embodied the opposite extreme, the ruler who claimed descent from dynasties stretching back through the mists of time. Born in 1530, Ivan Vasilievich was only 3 years old when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow, died. His early childhood was marked by palace intrigues, political instability, and the competing ambitions of noble families who sought to control the young prince and, through him, the Russian realm. These traumatic early experiences left their mark on Ivan's personality. Contemporary accounts describe a boy who grew into a young man of brilliant intelligence but also capable of sudden and terrifying rages, of acts of great piety followed by episodes of shocking cruelty. The nickname by which he is known to history, the Terrible, is perhaps better translated as the Formidable or the Awe-inspiring, for the Russian word Grozny carries connotations of majesty and fearfulness rather than simple evil. At the age of 16, in 1547, Ivan had himself crowned not merely as Grand Prince but as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, claiming for himself the imperial dignity of the old Roman emperors. This was no mere pretension. In Ivan's worldview, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Moscow had become the Third Rome, the true heir to Christian imperial authority. He saw himself as a ruler whose authority derived from God and from an unbroken line of succession stretching back through Byzantine emperors to the Caesars themselves. This exalted self-conception had profound implications for Ivan's foreign policy. He could not, would not, recognize any other monarch as his equal unless they too could claim ancient imperial bloodlines. In Ivan's eyes, Gustav Vasa of Sweden was an upstart, a commoner who had seized power through rebellion, a man whose very legitimacy was questionable. The personal tensions between these two strong-willed monarchs would prove to be one of the driving forces behind the war to come. By the 1550s, Ivan had already achieved significant military successes. In 1552, he had conquered the Khanate of Kazan, one of the successor states to the Mongol Golden Horde that had once dominated Russia. In 1556, he added the Khanate of Astrakhan to his realm. These victories expanded Russian territory significantly and enhanced Ivan's prestige. Yet they also created new strategic considerations. With threats from the east reduced, Ivan could turn his attention westward, to the Baltic region and the opportunities it presented. The Baltic Sea was the key to trade with Western Europe. Control of Baltic ports meant access to European markets, technology, and ideas. For a ruler as ambitious as Ivan, the lure of the Baltic was irresistible. But between Russia and the Baltic stood a patchwork of territories: the lands of the Livonian Order, the Swedish-controlled regions of Estonia and Finland, and the contested borderlands where Swedish and Russian claims overlapped. The borderlands, Karelia, and the contested frontier. To understand why Sweden and Russia went to war in 1554, we must turn our attention to the frontier region where their territorial claims met and conflicted. This was the land of Karelia, a region of dense forests, countless lakes, and long, dark winters, inhabited by Finnish and Karelian peoples whose way of life had changed little for centuries. The border between Sweden, Finland, and Russia and Karelia had been formally established by the Treaty of Göteborg in 1323, more than 2 centuries before the war we are discussing. This medieval agreement had drawn a line across the Karelian wilderness, dividing it between Swedish and Novgorodian, later Russian, spheres of influence. But treaties drawn up in distant capitals often meant little in remote frontier regions, and the border established at Göteborg had always been more theoretical than real. The people who actually lived along this frontier were caught between 2 expanding powers. Many spoke Finnish or Karelian languages, and followed traditional ways of life based on fishing, hunting, and small-scale agriculture. Religious affiliations provided one marker of identity. The Western Karelians had been converted to Catholicism and later Lutheranism by Swedish missionaries, while the Eastern Karelians followed Orthodox Christianity under Russian influence. But these religious boundaries were also fluid and contested. For the Swedish crown, Karelia and Finland represented not just territory, but a defensive buffer against Russian expansion. The great fortress of Viborg, built in the Middle Ages, stood as the key to Swedish control of the eastern frontier. From Swedish perspective, it was essential that this region remain under Stockholm's control, for, if it fell to Russia, the road to Sweden proper would be open. For Russia, the Karelian borderlands represented a frontier that could and should be pushed westward. Russian merchants and settlers had long been active in the region, and Russian Orthodox monasteries served as centers of both spiritual and political influence. The Pechenga Monastery, located in the far north on the Kola Peninsula, was one such institution, a remote outpost of Russian civilization in the Arctic wilderness. Between the official representatives of Swedish and Russian power, the reality on the ground was one of chronic low-level conflict. Raids across the border were common, as were counter-raids. Local officials on both sides engaged in what might charitably be called aggressive interpretation of their territorial rights, leading to what we might today call border incidents, but what contemporaries simply accepted as the normal state of affairs in frontier regions. This, then, was the tinderbox, a disputed frontier, a history of cross-border raids, 2 powerful monarchs with incompatible visions of their own authority, and a broader geopolitical situation that made control of the Baltic region increasingly important to both powers. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the conflict. The spark, raids and provocations, in 1554. The year 1554 began much like any other along the Swedish-Russian frontier, with the usual pattern of raids, counter-raids, and mutual recriminations. But this year, the cycle of violence would escalate beyond the normal boundaries of frontier conflict into something larger and more dangerous. The immediate trigger for the war came from Swedish actions in the far north. Swedish forces, acting either on orders from Stockholm or on their own initiative, sources differ on this point, launched a raid against the Pechenga Monastery. This was no ordinary border skirmish. The Pechenga Monastery was an important Orthodox religious institution, and its violation by Swedish troops was seen in Moscow not merely as a territorial provocation, but as an act of religious aggression, an attack on the Orthodox faith itself. The governor of Novgorod, a powerful noble named Poletsky, responded by sending an envoy named Nikita Kuzmin to Stockholm to demand an explanation for this outrage. This was a reasonable diplomatic response to an unreasonable action. By the customs of the time, Gustav Vasa should have received the Russian envoy, offered some explanation or apology, and worked to de-escalate the situation. Instead, Gustav had the Russian representative imprisoned. This was an extraordinary breach of diplomatic protocol, one that could not have been accidental. Ambassadors and envoys, even those from enemy states, were traditionally protected by their diplomatic status. To imprison a diplomatic representative was to declare, in effect, that normal rules no longer applied, that the situation had moved beyond the realm of peaceful negotiation. We can only speculate about Gustav Vasa's motivations for this provocative act. Perhaps he believed that a show of strength was necessary to deter further Russian encroachments. Perhaps he was responding to domestic political pressures or acting on incomplete information about the Russian raid that had prompted Kuzmin's mission. Or perhaps, after 3 decades on the throne, the aging Swedish king had grown overconfident in his ability to manage the Russian threat. Whatever Gustav's reasoning, the effect was clear. The situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Throughout the latter half of 1554, the border erupted in violence. Russian forces mounted raids along almost the entire length of the Finnish frontier, far more extensive and coordinated than the usual pattern of border skirmishes. Swedish territory was plundered, settlements were burned, and the civilian population suffered terribly. The Swedish response was equally aggressive. The local Swedish commander along the border, a man named Anders Nilsson, who served as the bailiff at the border town of Kivenab, decided to take matters into his own hands. Leading Swedish forces across the border, he launched retaliatory raids deep into Russian territory, bringing back plunder and establishing a pattern of tit-for-tat escalation that neither side seemed able or willing to stop. By the end of 1554, the situation had clearly moved beyond mere border skirmishes. Both sides were committing substantial military forces to operations along the frontier, and both were inflicting significant damage on civilian populations. The question was no longer whether there would be a war, but how large that war would become, and how it would end. The Russian Winter Campaign of January 1555. As the year turned to 1555, the people of Finland braced themselves for the worst. Word had reached Swedish authorities that the Russians were preparing a major military operation, and the target was clear: the fortress city of Viborg, the key to Swedish control of Karelia. Viborg was one of the strongest fortifications in the entire Nordic region. Originally founded in the Middle Ages, it had been repeatedly strengthened and expanded over the centuries. Its massive stone walls and strategic location on a peninsula made it a formidable obstacle to any attacker. More than just a military installation, Viborg was also an important commercial center, a city where Swedish, Finnish, German, and Russian merchants met to trade goods ranging from furs and timber to grain and manufactured products from the West. In January 1555, in the depths of the northern winter, a Russian army crossed the Finnish frontier and marched toward Viborg. The cold at this time of year is almost unimaginable to those who have not experienced it. Temperatures plunge far below freezing. Daylight is limited to just a few hours, and the landscape is buried under deep snow. Moving an army under these conditions required enormous logistical skill and placed tremendous demands on the soldiers, who had to cope not only with the enemy, but with the hostile environment itself. When the Russian forces arrived before Viborg and took up positions around the city, they faced a difficult decision. Viborg's defenses were strong, and the garrison was well prepared. Taking the fortress by storm would be costly in lives, and a prolonged siege in winter conditions would be even more difficult. The Russians examined the situation carefully, weighing their options. After 3 days of reconnaissance and deliberation, the Russian commanders made a decision that surprised many observers. They withdrew. The great army that had marched with such determination toward Viborg simply turned around and marched back into Russia. No major assault was launched, no siege equipment was deployed, no serious attempt to take the city was made. Why did the Russians withdraw? The sources of the time do not provide a clear answer, and historians have debated the question ever since. Perhaps the Russian commanders concluded that the fortress was too strong to be taken without unacceptable losses. Perhaps they had accomplished their real objective, which was simply to demonstrate Russian military power and put pressure on Sweden to negotiate. Perhaps supply difficulties or the onset of even worse weather forced their hand. Whatever the reason, the withdrawal brought a temporary lull in the fighting. The people of Viborg breathed a sigh of relief, and Swedish authorities had time to consider their response. But everyone knew that this was just the beginning. The Russians would return, and when they did, they would come in even greater force. The Battle of Kivenab, March 11th, 1555. The winter of 1555 gave way to early spring, and with the slightly warmer weather came renewed Russian military operations. This time, the Russians were not content with a reconnaissance in force or a demonstration of power. They were coming with an army of unprecedented size for operations in this theater, and they were determined to break through the Swedish defenses and establish Russian control over the disputed frontier region. In March 1555, a massive Russian army crossed the border into Swedish-controlled territory. Contemporary sources vary in their estimates of its size, but most agree that it numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men. This was an enormous force for the time and region, far larger than anything the local Swedish-Finnish defenders could hope to match in open battle. The Russian army was under the command of Prince Ivan Bibikov, a nobleman who had proven his military skill in Ivan IV's campaigns against the Tatar Khanates. Bibikov was an experienced commander who understood the challenges of operating in the harsh northern environment, and he had prepared his army well for the campaign ahead. The Russian objective was clear: to push westward through Swedish defenses and open the way for Russian occupation of a substantial portion of Karelia. If they succeeded, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region and could threaten Vyborg itself. Everything depended on breaking through the forward Swedish defensive line. The Swedes and Finns had not been idle during the winter months. Anticipating a major Russian offensive, they had constructed a defensive position along the Sisterbäck River, known in Russian as the Sestra River, which formed part of the boundary between Swedish and Russian-controlled territory. This defensive line, which Swedish sources describe as a former or forward wall, was designed to channel any Russian attack into a killing zone where Swedish firepower could be brought to bear most effectively. The small town of Kivenab, located at a strategic crossing point on the Sisterbäck, became the focal point of Swedish defensive preparations. It was here that the Swedish commanders expected the Russians to attempt their breakthrough, and it was here that they concentrated their limited forces. On the morning of March 11, 1555, the Russian army approached Kivenab. The Russian vanguard, estimated at about 12,000 men, a substantial portion of Bibikov's total force, moved forward to test the Swedish defenses. As they drew near, they could see the Swedish defensive positions along the river and the relatively small force that opposed them. The Swedish-Finnish force defending Kivenab was tiny in comparison to the Russian host. Contemporary accounts put their number at somewhere around 500 men, though reinforcements were reportedly on the way. This was a force outnumbered by more than 20 to 1, facing an enemy that included experienced soldiers fresh from victories in other campaigns. The Russian and Swedish forces faced each other across a distance of perhaps a few hundred meters. The tension must have been extraordinary. The Russian commanders could see how badly outnumbered the Swedish defenders were. Surely they would withdraw in the face of such overwhelming odds. But the Swedish-Finnish troops stood their ground, showing no sign of retreating. Then, according to one account that has come down to us, Prince Ivan Bibikov did something unexpected. He called for a cup of brandy to be brought to him. With both armies watching, he raised the cup in what appeared to be a toast toward the Swedish lines, drank it down, and then threw the cup to the ground. This gesture, though it might seem strange to us today, had a clear meaning to people of the 16th century. It was an insult, a contemptuous dismissal of the enemy's worth, a challenge that could not be ignored. Bibikov gave the order to attack. The Russian vanguard surged forward, moving across the snow-covered ground toward the Swedish positions. This was the moment when the battle would be decided, when the outnumbered Swedish-Finnish force would either break and run or stand and fight against impossible odds. The Swedish response was immediate and devastating. The Swedish artillery, which had been carefully positioned to cover the approaches to Kivenab, opened fire. The sound of the cannons echoed across the frozen landscape, and their fire tore into the advancing Russian ranks. One of the very first casualties was Prince Ivan Bibikov himself. The Russian commander, who moments before had been issuing orders and preparing to lead his men to victory, was struck down by Swedish fire. The death of their commander at the very start of the battle had a catastrophic effect on Russian morale. The vanguard, which had been advancing confidently just moments before, suddenly found itself leaderless and under heavy fire. The Swedish defenders, seeing the Russians falter, launched an immediate counterattack. Here, the Swedish forces benefited from a crucial tactical advantage. Many of their soldiers were equipped with skis and firearms, a combination that proved devastatingly effective in the snowy terrain. These ski troops could move rapidly across the snow that hindered the Russian advance, get within close range to fire their muskets, then quickly ski away to reload while their comrades kept up the pressure. This hit-and-run tactic, adapted to the unique conditions of winter warfare in the far north, proved highly effective against an enemy force that was larger but less mobile. The Russian soldiers, many of them from regions far to the south where winter warfare was unknown, struggled to maintain formation in the deep snow while under constant fire from an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The Swedish-Finnish defenders also included cavalry units contributed by the Finnish nobility. These horsemen, though small in number, added to the pressure on the Russian vanguard, which found itself attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle, which the Russians had expected to be a straightforward victory, won through overwhelming numbers, had turned into a confused and costly melee. As the fighting continued, the Russian vanguard began to break apart. Units lost cohesion, officers lost control of their men, and what had been an organized attack turned into a disorganized retreat. The death of Prince Bibikov had deprived the Russian force of unified command at the critical moment, and without clear leadership, the attack foundered. The main Russian army, which had been following behind the vanguard, now faced a difficult decision. They could commit more troops to the battle and try to overwhelm the Swedish defenders through sheer weight of numbers, or they could break off the engagement and withdraw. Given the confusion in their ranks, the unexpectedly strong Swedish resistance, and the death of their commander, the Russians chose to withdraw. The Battle of Kievanab ended in a stunning Swedish-Finnish victory. A force of perhaps 500 men had defeated a Russian army of more than 20,000, inflicting significant casualties and forcing the Russians to abandon their planned offensive. It was a victory that would resonate throughout Sweden and Finland, becoming one of those rare battles where overwhelming odds are overcome through superior tactics, favorable terrain, and sheer determination. For the Russians, Kievanab was a disaster. They had committed a major force to an offensive that was supposed to break Swedish resistance and open the way for Russian conquest of Karelia. Instead, they had been humiliated on the battlefield, lost their commander, and achieved nothing. The impact on Russian military planning and on Ivan IV's estimation of Swedish military capabilities can hardly be overstated. The failed Swedish siege of Oreshek. The victory at Kievanab had immediate strategic consequences. Swedish military leaders, emboldened by their success, decided to take the offensive themselves. If the Russians could be defeated when they attacked Swedish positions, perhaps now was the time to strike back, to seize key Russian fortresses and shift the balance of power along the frontier in Sweden's favor. The primary Swedish objective was the fortress of Oreshek, known to the Swedes as Nöteborg. This fortress, located at the point where the Neva River flows out of Lake Ladoga, was strategically vital. Whoever controlled Oreshek controlled access to the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland and the trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea with the interior of Russia. It was one of the strongest Russian fortifications in the region, with thick stone walls and a garrison that had been reinforced in anticipation of Swedish attacks. The Swedish plan called for a coordinated operation, combining land and naval forces. Admiral Johan Bragg was placed in command of the naval component, with orders to bombard the fortress from the water, while Swedish ground troops laid siege from the landward side. Swedish diplomats, meanwhile, were dispatched to Livonia, Poland, Lithuania, and England, seeking support for the Swedish cause and attempting to build a coalition against Russia. In concept, the plan was sound, but in execution, it quickly ran into difficulties. The Swedish commanders had failed to properly appreciate the challenges they would face in maintaining a siege of a well-fortified position far from their own supply bases. The first problem became apparent as soon as the Swedish forces arrived in the vicinity of Oreshek. The Russians had implemented a scorched earth policy in the surrounding area. Villages had been burned, crops destroyed, livestock driven away or slaughtered. There was nothing in the immediate vicinity of the fortress that could support an besieging army. Everything the Swedes needed, food, fodder for their horses, firewood for warming and cooking, would have to be brought up from Swedish-controlled territory along vulnerable supply lines. The second problem was that the fortress itself proved far more formidable than Swedish intelligence had suggested. Its walls were thick and well-maintained, its garrison was large and well-supplied, and its artillery could effectively engage any besiegers who came within range. Admiral Brigge's ships could bombard the fortress, but naval guns of the period lacked the power to make significant breaches in massive stone fortifications. The siege dragged on through the summer of 1555, with the Swedish forces unable to make meaningful progress. Each day brought new challenges. Supplies ran low, soldiers fell ill, and morale declined. Russian forces in the region, recovering from their defeat at Kievanab, began to harass Swedish supply lines, making an already difficult situation even worse. By late summer, it was clear that the siege was failing. The Swedish commanders faced an unpleasant reality. They could not take Orishek by direct assault. They lacked the resources to maintain a prolonged siege through another winter, and remaining in place would only lead to further losses without any realistic chance of success. The decision was made to abandon the siege and withdraw back to Swedish-controlled territory. The failure at Orishek demonstrated an important truth about warfare in this period and region. Taking fortified positions was extremely difficult, and even a victorious army could not always exploit its successes if logistics did not support sustained operations deep in enemy territory. Both sides would learn this lesson repeatedly throughout the war. The mysterious Russian retreat from Vyborg, January 1556. As winter returned in late 1555, both sides prepared for another campaign season. The Russians, stung by their defeat at Kievanab, but encouraged by the Swedish failure at Orishek, decided to launch another major offensive against Vyborg. If they could take this fortress, the entire Swedish position in Karelia would be compromised, and the way would be open for Russian expansion westward. In January 1556, a massive Russian army once again crossed the Finnish frontier and marched toward Vyborg. This time, the Russians were not merely conducting a reconnaissance. They were serious about taking the city. The army that approached Vyborg in the depths of winter numbered close to 20,000 men, perhaps the largest force yet committed to operations in this theater. On January 22, 1556, the Russian army took up positions around Vyborg and began their assault. This time, they came prepared with heavy artillery with the intention of battering breaches in the city's walls through which assault troops could pour. The bombardment began with a tremendous roar, as Russian cannon fired shot after shot at the fortress's defenses. Inside Vyborg, the Swedish garrison braced for what they knew would be a desperate fight. The city's defenders were well trained and well supplied, but they were also realistic about their chances if the Russians were willing to pay the price in blood necessary to take the fortress by storm. The bombardment continued throughout the day and into the night, the thunder of the guns echoing across the frozen harbor. But despite the intensity of the bombardment, the Russian artillery was making little impression on Vyborg's massive stone walls. These fortifications, built and rebuilt over centuries, were designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. The walls were thick enough to absorb the impact of cannonballs, and the defenders had supplies sufficient to hold out for months if necessary. After 3 days of bombardment with little to show for it, the situation took an unexpected turn. On January 25th, just as dawn was breaking, the Russian army began to withdraw. Once again, just as it happened the previous year, a Russian force that had come with apparent determination to take Vyborg simply packed up and marched away. The reason for this withdrawal has been the subject of much historical debate and speculation. According to one account that has become famous, though its accuracy is impossible to verify, the Russians withdrew because of a bizarre misunderstanding. The story goes that during the night, the garrison of Vyborg Castle received a delivery of hay for their horses. As wagons loaded with hay were driven across the castle's courtyard, the sound of the wagon wheels on the frozen ground carried across the silent winter landscape to the Russian positions. Russian sentries, hearing this noise in the darkness, reportedly interpreted it as the sound of cavalry on the move. Convinced that Swedish reinforcements were arriving, perhaps a large cavalry force that could threaten their siege lines, the Russians decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Rather than risk being caught in an untenable position between the fortress garrison and a relief force, they withdrew before dawn, taking their artillery with them. This story appears in several contemporary sources, though historians have questioned whether such a simple misunderstanding could really have caused the withdrawal of a major army. Alternative explanations have been proposed. Perhaps the Russians were running low on supplies and ammunition after days of intense bombardment. Perhaps word had reached them of military developments elsewhere that required their attention. Perhaps the army was suffering from disease, which was always a risk when large numbers of men were concentrated in unsanitary conditions in winter. Whatever the true reason, the effect was the same. For the second time in just over a year, Vyborg had been threatened by a Russian army, and for the second time, that army had withdrawn without seriously testing the fortress's defenses. The Swedish position in Karelia remained secure, and Swedish confidence in their ability to defend their eastern frontier was reinforced. The diplomacy of exhaustion. The path to peace. By the summer of 1556, both sides were beginning to recognize that the war was settling into a stalemate. The Russians had launched two major offensives aimed at Vyborg and had been forced to withdraw both times without achieving their objective. The Swedes had won a significant battlefield victory at Kievanab, but had failed in their own offensive at Oreshek. The war had demonstrated that both sides could defend their own territory effectively, but lacked the capability to make major conquests in enemy territory. For Gustav Vasa, now 60 years old and in declining health, the war had become an expensive distraction from other concerns. Sweden's economy, though stronger than it had been when he took power 3 decades earlier, was still relatively modest by European standards. Maintaining armies in the field, especially in the harsh conditions of the Karelian frontier, was draining the royal treasury without producing commensurate results. For Ivan IV, the strategic picture was also becoming clearer. The war with Sweden was tying down military resources that might be better employed elsewhere. To the west, the situation in Livonia was evolving in ways that demanded attention. The Livonian Order, a remnant of the medieval crusading era, was clearly in terminal decline, and its collapse would create an opportunity for territorial expansion that was far more promising than the frozen forests of Karelia. Both monarchs, therefore, had reasons to seek an end to the conflict, even if neither wanted to be seen as suing for peace from a position of weakness. The question was how to bridge the personal animosity that had characterized their relationship from the start. The personal dimension of the conflict cannot be overstated. Ivan IV still refused to recognize Gustav Vasa as his equal, and he had made this clear through various slights and insults. When Swedish ambassadors came to Russia, Ivan refused to receive them personally, insisting that they deal instead with the governor of Novgorod, as if Sweden were a mere tributary state rather than an independent kingdom. Gustav, for his part, had responded to these insults with his own acts of defiance, including the imprisonment of the Russian envoy that had helped trigger the war in the first place. The path to peace would require both monarchs to set aside, or at least paper over, these personal issues in favor of practical considerations. Swedish diplomats began to make overtures to Russian officials in Novgorod, where traditionally most Swedish-Russian diplomatic business was conducted. The Russians, while maintaining their stance that Ivan IV would not negotiate with Gustav directly, indicated a willingness to discuss terms. These preliminary negotiations took place throughout the second half of 1556. Both sides tested the waters, trying to determine what terms might be acceptable without appearing too eager for peace. Gradually, the outlines of a possible agreement began to emerge. The peace would essentially confirm the status quo. No significant territorial changes, no admission of fault by either side, no resolution of the fundamental disagreements about royal legitimacy that had contributed to the conflict. By early 1557, both sides were ready to move forward with formal peace negotiations. The question now was where these negotiations would take place and who would represent the two monarchs. The Moscow Embassy, a journey into the heart of Russia. The Swedish delegation that would travel to Russia to conclude the peace was chosen with great care. Leading it was Sten Eriksson Lejonhufvud, who was not only a prominent Swedish nobleman, but also Gustav Vasa's brother-in-law, married to the king's sister. This gave him a personal connection to the Swedish royal family that would signal to the Russians that Sweden was taking the negotiations seriously. Accompanying Sten Eriksson was Laurentius Petri, the Archbishop of Uppsala, and thus the highest-ranking clergyman in the Swedish Lutheran Church. Including the Archbishop in the delegation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the importance Sweden attached to the negotiations, it provided spiritual authority to the mission, and it would allow for discussions of religious matters, which Ivan IV, despite his reputation for cruelty, took very seriously. Also in the delegation was a figure who would become far more famous to later generations than he was in his own time. Michael Agricola, a Finnish scholar and clergyman who had recently completed a translation of the New Testament into Finnish. Agricola's inclusion reflected the Swedish kingdom's increasing attention to Finland, which was directly threatened by Russian expansion and whose people would bear the brunt of any future conflict. The Swedish delegation, numbering about 100 men in total, entered Russia in late 1556, after a Finnish clergyman named Knut Johannesson had traveled to Moscow earlier to obtain the necessary permits for the embassy. This was typical of the complex diplomatic protocols of the era. Even hostile powers maintained certain forms and courtesies that allowed for official communication. The journey from the Swedish frontier to Moscow was long and difficult, especially in winter conditions. The delegation traveled through landscapes that must have seemed alien to many of the Swedish members. Vast forests, seemingly endless plains, villages that were clearly poorer than their Swedish counterparts, and everywhere the sense of Russia's immense size and potential power. The delegation arrived in Moscow on February 24th, 1557, to begin what would be a long and at times frustrating series of negotiations. Moscow in the mid-16th century was a city of contradictions. It was the capital of a growing empire, yet many of its buildings were still constructed of wood rather than stone. It was home to magnificent churches with onion domes covered in gold leaf, yet also to crowded neighborhoods where ordinary people lived in conditions of considerable poverty. The Swedish delegates were housed not in the Kremlin itself, but in the Lithuanian embassy, a significant detail that spoke volumes about the diplomatic pecking order as Ivan IV saw it. By placing the Swedish delegation in accommodations normally reserved for envoys from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Ivan was making a point. Sweden was being treated as a secondary power, not as an equal to Russia. For the Swedish delegates, especially those who had fought in the war, or who understood the political stakes involved, this treatment must have been galling. But they were experienced diplomats who understood that their mission was too important to be derailed by questions of protocol or wounded pride. They had come to make peace, and make peace they would. The negotiations did not proceed quickly. Although the Swedish delegation had arrived in late February, the formal conclusion of the treaty was delayed until the end of March. The reason given was the observance of Lent, the period of fasting and religious reflection that precedes Easter in the Christian calendar. For the intensely religious Ivan IV, it would have been unthinkable to conclude an important treaty during this sacred period. But the delay also served diplomatic purposes. It gave both sides time to carefully review the terms of the proposed peace, to consider the implications of various clauses, and to ensure that no party was agreeing to something they might later regret. And it gave Ivan IV time to make a gesture that was clearly calculated to impress upon the Swedish delegates the glory and power of the Russian Tsar. To the surprise of the Swedish delegation, they received word that they would be granted a personal audience with Ivan IV himself. This was a significant concession, given Ivan's previous insistence that he would not meet with Swedish representatives. The Russians explained it as a special exception, a gracious act by the Tsar that should not be taken as setting any precedent for future relations. The audience took place in the Kremlin, the fortified complex at the heart of Moscow that served as both palace and administrative center. The Swedish delegates were led through corridors and halls decorated with icons and religious art, past guards in elaborate uniforms, until they came to the audience chamber where Ivan IV awaited them. Contemporary accounts describe Ivan as an impressive figure, tall, with piercing eyes, and a commanding presence that could be either terrifying or charismatic depending on his mood. He received the Swedish delegates with formal courtesy, though the entire encounter was choreographed to reinforce his superior status. The Swedes were required to observe elaborate protocols, and the conversation, while cordial, was carefully managed to avoid any appearance that Ivan was negotiating as an equal with representatives of Gustav Vasa. But the audience served its purpose. Face had been saved on both sides, and the path was now clear for the formal conclusion of the peace treaty. The Treaty of Novgorod, April 2nd, 1557. On April 2nd, 1557, in the ancient city of Novgorod, the Peace of Novgorod was formally concluded between Sweden and Russia. Novgorod was an appropriate venue. It was the traditional point of contact between these two powers, and its very name evoked centuries of Swedish-Russian relations, both peaceful and hostile. The ceremony marking the conclusion of the treaty followed Russian Orthodox traditions. The Swedish delegates, led by Archbishop Laurentius Petri, kissed the cross in accordance with Russian custom, a ritual that Ivan IV had insisted upon as a sign of the treaty's solemnity and binding nature. For the Lutheran Swedes, this Catholic-style religious ceremony may have been uncomfortable, but they understood its importance to their Russian counterparts. The terms of the treaty itself were remarkably simple, especially given the 3 years of warfare that had preceded it. Essentially, the treaty established a truce that was to last for 40 years, until 1597. During this period, there were to be no hostilities between the two powers, and no changes to the borders that had existed before the war. In other words, the treaty confirmed the status quo ante bellum. Everything would go back to the way it had been before the fighting started. The treaty also included provisions for the treatment of merchants. Traders from both countries were to be allowed to cross the border freely for commercial purposes, with protections for their persons and property. This was a practical recognition that, whatever the political tensions between the two crowns, there were mutual economic benefits to maintaining trade relations. There was, however, one significant additional provision. Sweden agreed not to provide military support to Livonia or to Poland-Lithuania in the event of a war between those powers and Russia. This clause revealed what was really on Ivan IV's mind, not the frozen wastes of Karelia, but the rich lands of Livonia, which were ripe for conquest. By securing Swedish neutrality in advance, Ivan was laying the groundwork for the Livonian War that would begin just 1 year later. What the treaty did not resolve was the underlying disagreement about status and legitimacy that had poisoned Swedish-Russian relations. Ivan IV still did not recognize Gustav Vasa as his equal, and the treaty included provisions specifying that in the future, Swedish envoys would not be received in Moscow, but would deal with Russian officials in Novgorod. From the Russian perspective, this was entirely appropriate. Great czars did not negotiate with mere kings, especially kings who had won their crowns through rebellion, rather than inheriting them by divine right. From the Swedish perspective, these provisions were humiliating, but they were also pragmatic. Gustav Vasa had achieved his main objective. The war was over, Sweden's eastern frontier was secure, and his kingdom could return to the tasks of internal development and economic growth. If the price for peace was accepting some diplomatic slights from a ruler whom Gustav considered an arrogant tyrant, so be it. The financial cost of the peace was substantial for Sweden. The treaty required Sweden to pay 200,000 marks to Russia, an enormous sum that strained the Swedish treasury. This payment was framed not as an indemnity or tribute, but as part of the costs of concluding the peace, a face-saving formulation that allowed Gustav to avoid the appearance of paying ransom or admitting defeat. The return journey, Michael Agricola's final mission. With the treaty concluded and the formal ceremonies completed, the Swedish delegation prepared for the long journey home. They had accomplished their mission, and now they looked forward to returning to their families and their regular duties after months away from home. The return journey, however, would be marked by tragedy. Michael Agricola, the Finnish scholar and translator who had been part of the delegation, fell ill during the trip back to Sweden. The exact nature of his illness is not recorded in the surviving sources, but travel conditions in the 16th century were harsh, and diseases spread easily among people living in close quarters under difficult circumstances. Agricola's condition worsened as the delegation made its way westward. By the time they reached the town of Uusikirko, known today as Paulian, it was clear that Agricola was dying. There, in a small Finnish town far from his home, the great translator and father of Finnish written language breathed his last. Agricola's death at this moment, just as peace was being restored between Sweden and Russia, carries a certain poignancy. His translation of the New Testament into Finnish had been a monumental achievement, making the scriptures accessible to ordinary Finnish people in their own language for the first time. His work represented the same spirit of reformation and renewal that Gustav Vasa had championed in Sweden. The idea that religion and learning should not be confined to a Latin-speaking elite, but should be available to all people in languages they could understand. The delegation buried Agricola in Usikirko and continued their journey, carrying the news of both the peace treaty and the death of one of Finland's greatest scholars. When they finally reached Stockholm and presented themselves to Gustav Vasa, they could report that the mission had been successful, the war was over, and Sweden's position was secure, even if the cost had been high, both in money and in human lives. The aftermath. Uneasy peace and the shadow of future conflicts. The Peace of Novgorod brought an end to active hostilities between Sweden and Russia, but it did not resolve the underlying tensions that had caused the war. The frontier between the two powers remained disputed in practice, even if it was theoretically settled by treaty. Cross-border raids, though less frequent and less organized than during the war years, continued to occur. Local officials on both sides tested the boundaries of the agreement, and the central governments in Stockholm and Moscow were not always successful in controlling the actions of their frontier administrators. For Gustav Vasa, the peace represented both a success and a disappointment. He had secured Sweden's eastern frontier without suffering any significant territorial losses, which was no small achievement given the size and power of Russia. But he had failed in his larger strategic goal of extending Swedish influence into Livonia, and the financial costs of the war had been significant. The 200,000 marks paid to Russia as part of the peace settlement was a sum that would take years to recover. In his final years, Gustav would die in 1560, just 3 years after the peace. The aging king focused on securing the succession for his sons and on consolidating the administrative and religious reforms that had been his life's work. The Russian War became one more chapter in a long and eventful reign, remembered more for the Battle of Kievanab than for any lasting strategic impact. For Ivan IV, the peace with Sweden cleared the way for what he had long planned, the conquest of Livonia. With Sweden committed to neutrality by the terms of the Peace of Novgorod, Ivan could move against the Livonian order without fear of Swedish intervention. In 1558, just 1 year after the peace with Sweden, Russian armies invaded Livonia, beginning what would become a 25-year struggle involving not just Russia and Sweden, but also Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. The Livonian War would dwarf the Swedish-Russian conflict of 1554 to 1557 in scale and significance. It would involve larger armies, more devastating campaigns, and ultimately result in significant territorial changes. But the earlier war had established patterns that would recur in the later conflict. The difficulty of taking fortified positions, the challenge of maintaining supply lines in harsh terrain, and the tendency of wars in this region to settle into stalemates in which neither side could achieve decisive victory. The legacy, lessons, and remembrance. The Great Russian War of 1554 to 1557 has been somewhat overshadowed in historical memory by the larger and more consequential conflicts that followed it. The Livonian War, the Great Northern War of the early 18th century, and the various other Swedish-Russian conflicts of the early modern period have attracted more attention from historians and occupy more prominent places in national narratives. Yet the 1554 to 1557 war deserves to be remembered, for it established several important precedents and taught valuable lessons to both powers. For Sweden, the war demonstrated that with good defensive positions, competent leadership, and motivated soldiers, it was possible to defeat much larger Russian forces. The victory at Kievanab became part of Swedish military tradition, an example of how tactical skill and knowledge of local conditions could overcome numerical inferiority. The war also demonstrated the limits of what each side could achieve. Russia's attempts to take Vyborg had failed twice, showing that well-fortified positions defended by determined garrisons were extremely difficult to capture. Sweden's failed siege of Oreshek had demonstrated the same lesson from the other perspective. In the warfare of this period, defense had significant advantages over offense, especially in the harsh conditions of the northern frontier. For the people who lived in the contested borderlands, the war brought suffering that is easy to overlook in accounts focused on kings, battles, and treaties. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, families were torn apart as men went off to fight, and the civilian population endured raids from both sides. The Treaty of Novgorod may have ended the formal state of war, but it did little to improve the daily lives of the Finnish and Karelian peasants who bore the brunt of the conflict. The diplomatic aspects of the war, the personal antagonism between Gustav Vasa and Ivan IV, the questions of status and legitimacy, the protocols and insults that characterized their relationship, reflected broader questions about the nature of monarchy and sovereignty in this period. Gustav represented a new type of monarch, one who had achieved power through personal ability and popular support rather than hereditary right. Ivan represented an older model, one that emphasized divine sanction and unbroken lineages stretching back to imperial antiquity. This clash of monarchical ideologies would not be resolved in the 16th century. Indeed, similar questions about the nature of legitimate authority would continue to drive conflicts across Europe for centuries to come. The Russian refusal to recognize the Swedish king as an equal and the Swedish refusal to accept that refusal were not merely personal quirks, but reflected fundamental disagreements about political philosophy, reflections on winter warfare, and northern strategy. One of the most striking aspects of the Great Russian War is the role that climate and geography played in shaping military operations. This was warfare conducted in one of the harshest environments on Earth, where winter temperatures could drop to deadly levels and where the landscape itself, with its forests, lakes, and marshlands, presented obstacles as formidable as any enemy army. Both sides learned to adapt to these conditions, though neither perfectly mastered the challenges involved. The Swedish-Finnish use of ski troops at Kievan Ab showed how local knowledge and specialized equipment could provide crucial tactical advantages. The Russian winter campaigns against Vyborg demonstrated both the logistical sophistication required to move large armies in winter conditions and the difficulties of maintaining siege operations when temperatures plunged below freezing. The geography of the region, the placement of fortresses like Vyborg and Oreshek at strategic choke points, the role of rivers and lakes in channeling movement, the importance of forest cover for concealment and ambush, shaped how both sides planned and executed their operations. This was not warfare that could be conducted according to textbook principles developed for operations in Central or Western Europe. It required adaptation, innovation, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. The supply challenges were particularly acute. Armies of this period already faced significant logistical difficulties, but operating in regions where local resources were scarce and where transportation was difficult magnified these problems. The failure of the Swedish siege of Oreshek was fundamentally a logistical failure. The Swedish army could not maintain itself in the field long enough to accomplish its mission. Russian operations, while better supplied, also ran into logistical constraints that limited what could be achieved. The human dimension, soldiers, commanders, and civilians. Behind the strategic considerations and diplomatic maneuverings, the Great Russian War was ultimately a human experience, one that affected the lives of thousands of individuals in profound ways. For the soldiers who fought at Kievan Ab, or who stood guard on Vyborg's walls, or who endured the failed siege of Oreshek, the war was not an abstract historical event, but a lived reality of fear, exhaustion, hunger, cold, and occasionally, the terror and exhilaration of combat. Prince Ivan Bibikov, the Russian commander who fell in the first moments of the Battle of Kievan Ab, was more than just a name in the historical record. He was a man with a family, with ambitions, with a military career that had brought him to high command. In a different universe, with slightly different circumstances, he might have won the battle and returned home a hero. Instead, a Swedish cannonball ended his life and changed the course of the campaign. The Swedish-Finnish defenders, who stood their ground at Kievan Ab, outnumbered more than 20-1, showed a kind of courage that deserves to be remembered. They could have withdrawn in the face of impossible odds. No one would have blamed them. Instead, they fought and won, through a combination of favorable defensive positions, effective use of firepower, tactical innovation, and simple stubborn determination not to give ground. Michael Agricola, who died on the return journey from Moscow, represented a different kind of service to his country. As a scholar and translator, he fought not with weapons, but with words, working to elevate and educate his people. That he died while serving on a diplomatic mission shows that service to one's nation could take many forms, and that all of them involve sacrifice. For the civilian populations of the frontier regions, the war meant disruption, destruction, and death. When raiding parties crossed the border, Swedish or Russian, It was usually not military installations they targeted, but villages and farms, the homes of people who had little say in the political disputes that led to war. These forgotten victims of the conflict deserve to be remembered alongside the kings and generals whose names dominate the historical accounts. The long view from 1557 to the modern era. As we look back on the Great Russian War from our vantage point more than 4.5 centuries later, we can see patterns and connections that were invisible to contemporaries. The war was one episode in a much longer story of Swedish-Russian competition for dominance in the Baltic region, a competition that would continue for more than 2 centuries and that would shape the history of Northern Europe. The Peace of Novgorod, held for barely a year before hostilities resumed, not between Sweden and Russia directly, but in the complicated multi-sided conflict of the Livonian War. That war would last from 1558 to 1583, involving not just Sweden and Russia, but also Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark, all competing for control of the territories left vacant by the collapse of the Livonian Order. The 17th century would see Sweden rise to become one of Europe's great powers, controlling territories all around the Baltic Sea and playing a major role in the 30 Years' War. This period of Swedish greatness, however, would end with catastrophic defeat in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, when Russian Tsar Peter the Great finally achieved what Ivan IV had dreamed of: Russian dominance over the Baltic region and the reduction of Sweden to secondary power status. The territories fought over in 1554 to 1557, Karelia, Ingria, the lands around Vyborg, would change hands multiple times over the centuries. The fortress of Vyborg itself, which successfully resisted Russian attacks in 1555 and 1556, would eventually fall to Russia in 1710 during the Great Northern War, and its story would continue through the 20th century, when it was fought over yet again during the Winter War and Continuation War between Finland and the Soviet Union. Today, the border between Finland and Russia runs through regions that witnessed the campaigns of 1554 to 1557. The fortress of Vyborg, now Vyborg, stands in Russian territory, about 90 miles northwest of St. Petersburg. The battlefield of Kievanab is marked on modern maps, though little visible trace of the battle remains. The rivers, forests, and lakes look much as they did in the 16th century, though the people who live there now would barely recognize the world of Gustav Vasa and Ivan IV. Concluding thoughts: the weight of history. As our story comes to a close, it is worth reflecting on what the Great Russian War of 1554 to 1557 can teach us, not just about the past, but about the nature of conflict and international relations more generally. The war reminds us that personal factors, the egos of rulers, questions of status and prestige, insults real and imagined, can play important roles in causing conflicts. The personal antagonism between Gustav Vasa and Ivan IV, Ivan's refusal to recognize Gustav as his equal, the various diplomatic slights and provocations, these might seem petty compared to the real issues of territory and security, but they were real factors that influenced decision-making on both sides. At the same time, the war shows us that even when personal animosities run deep, practical considerations can eventually lead to peace. Both Gustav and Ivan had reasons to continue the war, and both had been personally insulted by the other. Yet, when it became clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory at acceptable cost, both were willing to set aside their personal feelings in favor of a pragmatic settlement. The war also illustrates how difficult it is to predict the outcomes of military conflicts. The Russians, with their superior numbers and resources, had every reason to expect success against Sweden. Yet, Swedish defensive advantages, tactical innovations like the use of ski troops, and simple good fortune at critical moments, like the death of Prince Bibikov at Kievanab, combined to frustrate Russian ambitions. In warfare, as in so much of life, outcomes are contingent, and what seems inevitable beforehand can look very different afterward. Finally, the Great Russian War reminds us that even conflicts that end in stalemate and achieve little in terms of concrete results still matter to the people who experience them, for the soldiers who fought and sometimes died, for the civilians whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed, for the diplomats and officials who worked to end the fighting. This was not a footnote but a central event in their lives. History is not just the story of great changes and dramatic transformations. It is also the story of smaller events that matter deeply to those who lived through them. The spring night grows late, and our journey through the Great Russian War of 1554 to 1557 comes to an end. We have traveled from the court of Gustav Vasa in Stockholm to the Kremlin in Moscow, from the frozen battlefield of Kievanab to the walls of Vyborg, from the failed siege of Oreshek to the negotiating chambers of Novgorod. We have met kings and commanders, soldiers and diplomats, and we have tried to understand the world they inhabited and the choices they made. The war they fought ended more than 4 centuries ago. The kingdoms they served have changed beyond recognition or disappeared entirely. The issues they fought over have been settled and forgotten, only to be replaced by new disputes and new conflicts. Yet, in studying their story, we connect with something fundamental in human experience: the struggle between nations, the impact of leadership, the role of chance in history, and the enduring question of how peoples and nations can find ways to live together in peace despite their differences. May their story, with all its drama and tragedy, its moments of courage and its episodes of futility, help us to better understand our own world and the challenges we face in seeking peace among nations. And may we remember that behind every historical event, behind every battle and treaty, behind every date and statistic, are individual human beings whose hopes and fears, whose courage and suffering deserve to be honored and remembered. The fire burns low, the hour grows late, and it is time to rest. Tomorrow brings new challenges, new stories, new lessons to be learned from the vast archive of human history. But tonight, we have remembered the Great Russian War of 1554 to 1557, and in remembering, we have honored those who lived through it. Rest well, and may your dreams be peaceful. This has been the story of the Great Russian War, told so that we might understand the past and, perhaps, learn something that might help us face the future with wisdom and compassion. Good night.